In this lesson, we will learn the difference between a food chain and a food web. To learn the difference between this food chain and food web, let us first revise what was a food chain. In the first picture, we have a food chain. We had the grass, and this grass was eaten by the grasshopper, so there was a transfer of energy from the grass to the grasshopper. The grasshopper is now eaten by the frog. So again, there's a transfer of energy from the grasshopper to the frog. The frog is now eaten by the snake. So there's a transfer of energy to the snake. The snake is then eaten by a hawk. There's a transfer of energy to the hawk. The hawk is then decomposed by fungi and decomposer and returns back to the soil. So this was a food chain. But however, food chains do not operate in isolation. It is so because in environment, each organism is generally eaten by two or more kinds of organisms, which is in turn eaten by several other organisms. This is clear from the next picture. In the next picture, we see a straight food chain. Here we have the snail being eaten by the bird, and the bird with the larger bird. But if you see, the flower is not only eaten by the snail, it is also consumed by a caterpillar. This plant will also be consumed by the rabbit and also by the snail. Then the snail will be consumed by the bird by the hawk. Now the hawk does not only eat the bird, it also eats the lizard, it also eats the rabbit. So these food chains do not exist in isolation. In an environment, in an ecosystem, many food chains get interlocked. Let's look up in the next example here. So here we have the grass. Now grass is eaten by the rabbit, the grass is eaten by the insect, or also by the slug. Again, the grasshopper. The grasshopper is eaten by a bird. It could be eaten by a vole or a frog. So the single grasshopper could be eaten by many other organisms. Now here we have the picture of the rabbit being eaten by the fox. We could have the rabbit be eaten by also a snake, a python. In this case also we have the frog, the fox eating the frog, or we have the vole being eaten by the frog. We have the rat being eaten by the hawk. Here the bird being eaten by the hawk. The bird could also be eaten by a snake. So many of these food chains get interlocked, and thus we get a network of food chains, and that is called a food web. Here is a picture of the food web from your textbook. And in this food web, we have seen that each organism is generally eaten by two or more other kinds of organisms. Like for example, if you see this rat is been eaten by so many organisms. If you see the snake does not eat only the frog. It eats the bird, it eats the rat. So every organism is a part of many food chains, and these food chains are interlocked. So instead of a straight line food chain, here we have a series of branching lines called a food web. Let's make this point clear. Here we have one food chain. Then we will have another food chain here. Then we have again another food chain here. So we have here so many food chains are interlocked. We have one food chain here. Here we have another food chain. So there are so many food chains that are interlocked or interconnected to give us this food web. So a food web is many food chains connected to one another. Let's go ahead and learn the differences between food chain and food web. So the first picture is that of a food chain. and this is a picture of a food web. And the definition of a food chain, it is a series of organisms feeding on one another with repeated eating and being eaten. Like for the snake, it eats the frog and it's being eaten by the hawk. When it comes to the frog, it eats the grasshopper and it's being eaten by the snake. So it's a series of organisms feeding on one another with repeated eating and being eaten. When we come to food web, is a network of food chains, and we have seen there are so many food chains in a food web. Here there is one food chain, then we have another food chain here, then there is another food chain here, there's a third food chain here. There are so many food chains all interconnected. Here another food chain, so many food chains all interconnected. So a network of food chains which become interconnected at various levels so as to form a number of feeding connections among different organisms of an ecosystem. The next difference is the trophic level of an organism is fixed. Like if you see in this picture, this is the first level, the grasshopper occupies the second level, the frog occupies the third, snake the fifth level, fourth level and the fifth level. But however, when it comes to the food web, the organisms occupy different trophic levels. They may occupy in one, it may occupy the second level, in another food chain it may occupy the third level. So they don't have a fixed trophic level. Now another important point here is that food chains are not stable. Now what would happen if we were to eliminate the snake? For some reasons the snakes in that area were all destroyed or were killed. What would happen? Then you will notice that the frogs, there will be nobody to eat the frogs. So that there will be an increase in population of the frog. The number of frogs would increase. But what would happen to the hawk? There would be a decrease in population, because the hawk would now have no snakes to eat. Its food would be taken away. So there would be a decrease in population of the hawk, but there would be an increase in population of the frog. And ultimately the whole food chain would then collapse. So we say that food chains are not stable. If one organism becomes extinct, the food chain collapses. But that does not happen in food web. In food web is more stable. If you were to remove any one of the organisms, like in this case, if you were to remove the frog here, the snake could still eat many other organisms. It does not depend only on the frog for its food. It depends on, can also eat other organisms. So the whole food web would not collapse. The ecosystem would not collapse. So thus we see that the food chain is less stable while the food web is more stable. Let's get up to another example. What would happen if the number of frogs were eliminated? Then the number of grasshoppers in that area would increase. But however, the number of snakes would slowly decrease. And at last the food chain would collapse. How do unwanted chemicals or fertilizers enter the food chain? To explain this, we'll see in this picture. We at times add pesticides and fertilizers to our soil in order to get better harvest. Now when the plants grow on the soils, these fertilizers or these chemicals enter into the food, into the plants of that area. So the plants live on the soil and absorb the nutrients from the soil. These pollutants now enter into herbivores like that of a mouse or a cow, or some insects that feed on these plants. These herbivores are later eaten by carnivores, and they then enter into the animals' bodies of the carnivores. These chemicals that enter into the food chain do not degrade very easily, and as we go up the food chain, we find that their concentration keeps increasing. Like in this food chain here, we will see the first water. Here is water, and there is only 2 parts per million. Then there in this water we have the plankton. These are little organisms that live in water which have now 5 parts per million. The concentration of the pollutants has increased. In the fish it is even more, and in the bird, aquatic bird, it is a maximum. So the concentration of these chemicals keep increasing as we go to higher levels. This phenomena is called biological magnification. We have yet another example here of biological magnification. In the first picture we see that DDT, which we use to destroy the insects, is present in the water in a very small amount. Then from the water it enters into the zooplanktons, and the concentration increases further. From the zooplanktons it now enters into the small fish. The concentration further increases. From the small fish it enters into the larger fish, and then at last it enters into the fish eating birds, and the concentration of the DDT in the fish eating birds is as high as 25 parts per million. We had started with a very small number, and now we have reached to 25 parts per million. To make this point even clear, let us take this example of this food chain. Now in this food chain here, each of these organisms say have two parts of this pollutant. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Now these 14 are eaten by these insects. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 that have entered into these insects. Now these insects are eaten by the fish. So these 14 will now enter the fish. So we'll have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And now all these pollutants are now entered into the swan, because the swan eats all this fish. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So when you look up here, you find that the swan, which is at a higher level, has maximum concentration of DDT or the pollutant. So higher the level of the organisms, more is a pollutant present in it. So we can define biological magnification as a progressive increase in the concentration of harmful non-biodegradable chemicals at higher trophic levels. The next question comes, is it better to be a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian? So here first is the flow chart of a vegetarian. When a man is a vegetarian, he occupies the second level, because this is the first level and he eats only vegetables, so he occupies the second level. But if he is a non-vegetarian, he will occupy at least a third or the fourth level. So this is the first level. Then you have the herbivores, and if he is a non-veg, he occupies the third level. Now biological magnification is more as you go higher up. So when he is a non-vegetarian, because he occupies a higher level of at least the third level, the amount of chemicals collected in his body will be much more than when he is a vegetarian. So in this picture I have put the pollutants in as red dots. So when he is occupying the third level here, the number of pollutants collecting in his body is much higher than when he is a vegetarian, because in vegetarian he occupies only the second level.